Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, maybe good night. To everybody, welcome. My name is Monique Giggy. I'm the Managing Director of Singularity University Ventures, and I want to welcome you all to 10 Ways to Prepare Your Startup for Growth and Scale with Pascal Finette. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about Singularity University in case, for some crazy reason, you never heard of us. So our mission is to educate, inspire, and empower leaders to apply exponential technologies to address humanity's grand global challenges. And at the end of the day, what that means is we want to take technology to help make the world a better place. So I'm super curious, where is everybody from? There is a poll. Just give us an indication so we can see where you all are. Wow, lots from Europe, North America, sweet, Africa, welcome, Asia, hello, and the Middle East, South America creeping in, whoa, here we go, Europe on the rise, Australia and Oceania, nobody. They must not like us down under, what the heck?
It's also 2 a.m., just saying.
Well, that explains it. All right, lots of people from Europe, there we are. So, on the left, there we are. On the left, that's me. I'm Monique Giggy, as I mentioned before. I have the awesome job of being the Managing Director of SU Ventures, where I get to work with startups from all over the world. And on your right, with me today is our Faculty Chair of Entrepreneurship, Pascal Finette.
Hello, everybody.
So here's what we're going to do today. We've got a bit of a program overview because I know there's a lot of curiosity about there as into what is SU Ventures and how do I get involved. And then also the bulk of the program content will be around learning how to scale your startup. So we've got some fun stuff prepared for you. All of the questions we're going to save till the end in the last 15 minutes, but please, if something comes up, you want to holler at us, just type it into the chat window. It's there on your left. If you're having any kind of audio problems, don't worry. This is being recorded, and we'll try to get you squared away, okay? All right, so SU Ventures, our mission is literally to increase the total number of startups focused on impact globally. And the reason that we're doing this is because out of 580 million entrepreneurs globally, only 3% as of 2017 are currently focused on impact. And I think if we are ultimately going to solve humanity's global challenges, then we need more entrepreneurs, more domain experts, and people collaborating and working together to start social enterprises and startups to make that happen. So the way that we work with entrepreneurs is through a series of programs that we offer here at SU, and they're boot camps in nature, and they're all mapped to three very specific outcomes: access to connections, to customers, and ultimately to capital. On the connection side, so we run some sprints that you're going to have to bear with me here. It looks like we've got a delay in advancing of the slides. No? Are we good? I'm looking at my program producer here. She says, are we good? All right, there we are. We're live! Woohoo! Okay, so we run a series of sprints that are designed with one key thing. They're imagine like a 2-week hyper accelerator that helps you focus on what matters. They're heavily milestone based because in the years of working with startups, what I've discovered universally is that there's so much that we have to do and so much we have to accomplish. There's product roadmaps, there's funding strategies, there's sales and business development, and trying to figure out and sift through the noise to find what to focus on is the key thing that matters that'll move a business forward. And so these hyper accelerators or our sprints are designed to do exactly that. At that time, we also introduced you to a board of advisors that we curate from our incredible faculty, staff, and our network of over 200,000 people within our community globally, and 56,000 of them actually alumni. So these are individuals that come and work with you and sit on your board. If you want to kind of see a cool little, what do you call those, word cloud things, to see what the domain expertise is in our network, It will eventually pop up momentarily at some point in time. So typically, the startups in our portfolio, will match them up with 3 to 4 different people from their board of advisors. And as you come and work with the SU Ventures mentors and faculty and staff, we'll be introducing you to different types of corporate individuals, people within our community of Fortune 500s. We work with the likes of Deloitte and Google, USAID, and the World Bank Group. So lots of incredible people. That's really what SU is all about. We believe in an ecosystem and collaboration at the heart of everything that we do. And so when we bring a startup here and put them in the middle of our impact partners, like our development organizations and our Fortune 500 partners, like, it's incredible what ends up happening. More doors open faster as startups work together. And the last thing that we do is we run another couple of boot camps that are focused specifically on funding. As an impact-focused startup, there's access to types of capital that most startups don't even consider, and that's in the areas of philanthropy and through grants. So we teach our startups how to raise money from grants. Oh, thank you. Yep. Sorry, guys and gals. I don't know. It's not advancing for me. Okay. I'm just going to keep on going. Eventually, these slides will catch up to what I'm talking about. But let me just tell you about these boot camps. So we talked a little bit about philanthropy and venture capital. The raising money from those sources is entirely different. The way that you craft your pitch, the way that the words that you use, the way that you position yourself within the organization, or position yourself to these types of investors. And so we've separated out both boot camps, and we run them separately. Okay. And the last thing that we do is we have a series of portfolio retreats and summits. SU will run 18 global summits next year all over the world. And we use this as an opportunity to connect our startups that are in different countries with our network, and then bring them together to deliver content or really learn and network from each other. So this is what our programs for 2018 look like. Happy to take any questions as they roll in, but I'll answer them at the end. And if you're curious about, how Ventures is doing, we've currently got 56 companies in our portfolio. Collectively, they've raised $220 million, created over 500 jobs, and we are truly global in nature, with about 75% of our founders being non-US based. So we really care about the world, and we really care about global entrepreneurs. And so if that's you, I highly recommend checking us out on our website, su.org/ventures, or ask any questions that you want here. So without any further ado, and for the meat of this program, I want to introduce you to Pascal Funette to talk with you about how to grow and scale your startup.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monique. It's a true honor and pleasure to be here with you today. And what I want to talk to you about is kind of like the lessons we have learned by working with our portfolio companies, as well as surveying and studying and understanding companies in our ecosystem, as well as truly around the world, to figure out how do you scale a company. And before we get there, I want to pose a quick question for the people on the phone and on the webinar. And tell me how many people work in your company today, and you will see why that makes sense as a question in just 1 second. But if you could give me a quick answer, like how big is your company, just to understand like what are we dealing here with. And again, like you will see momentarily why that is important. So as we're seeing the results coming in here on our end, it looks like we have predominantly small companies here, so predominantly companies which are less than about 10 people. And interesting enough, the second largest group is companies which are 200 and more people, so our friends from medium-sized enterprises to large-scale enterprises, so fascinating group. Let me quickly pop up the results for you so you can see them. So about 70% of you are truly in the startup phase. and then about 15% at the other end of the spectrum. So the reason why I posed that question for you is very, very simple. As you're thinking about scaling and as you're thinking about the strategies you should deploy to scale your company and the things which you should consider when thinking about scaling, it is incredibly important to understand and figure out what type of scaling is the right way of scaling for you. And what I mean with this is very simple. Broadly speaking, there's two spectra on this scale on how do you scale your startup. On one hand, you can scale through organic growth. So you basically scale by funding your growth through revenue, simple revenue, cash flow. That's one way of scaling. And you know, like your classic example is the bakery down the road or the hairdresser salon, but also quite a few startups in the tech space. So good examples of this is a company called Atlassian, which you might have heard of coming out of Australia. They bootstrapped and scaled their business to literally hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, never ever taking any capital to accelerate their growth. The same is true for a company called MailChimp. They're an email marketing software company out of Atlanta, as well as is true for the company called Basecamp, formerly known as 37 Signals. Now, the other end of the spectrum is you scale by deploying capital, meaning you raise capital with the distinct purpose of scaling your business. And sometimes that is very necessary, and we'll get into the details of that. But very broadly speaking, if you have a market which requires you to be fast, where you have a market where you have lots of competition, it might make it necessarily for you to raise capital to get to scale. The thing I want you to keep in mind, though, is, and this is a meta discussion for you, is what you'll do is the moment you raise capital, you give up control. So you will find yourself always in this interesting dichotomy between raising capital and getting money to accelerate your growth versus maintaining control of your company. Very simply, most forms of capital are what we call dilutive, meaning you will give capital and you will give, you receive capital and you will give equity in response, and that means you have less control of your company. A typical startup, just to give you like a little bit of an idea, a typical startup, once you get to like your Series B or Series C funding, which is kind of the way, like the kind of stage where most startups start to think about exiting their companies, either by selling or probably going IPO, the founders typically have less than about 20% of the company. So you have ceded control of your company to your shareholders by that point. So keep that in mind. I want to do one more quick poll with you, and I want to just ask you, are you currently actively working on a scaling strategy? So are you currently actively thinking about scaling? Or is this something, you know, it's kind of like in the back of your mind, you're thinking about it, it hasn't really materialized yet. Just want to understand where we are in the process. And again, like as we're seeing the results coming in, I give you a tiny little bit more about time here. It's actually pretty fascinating. It's like roughly like a 2/3, 1/3 scenario, which is probably what we could have expected. Probably, we'll see. So let me quickly show you the results here. So about 60% of you are actively working on a scaling strategy. About 40% are not quite there yet. So this is good news. This webinar is for both groups of you. So let's get into it. Reason why I asked you the very first question about like the size of your company is because growth and scaling happens at in different phases, and those phases are determined by the size of your company. Meaning the amount of people working in your company, the amount of revenue you're generating, et cetera. And you need to accommodate your scaling strategy towards this. There's a wonderful work which has been done by Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn and now a partner at Greylock Venture, one of the top VC firms here in Silicon Valley. And if you're really interested in this, I highly recommend looking this up. There's a Stanford class called Blitz Scaling. So a lot of this insight is glimpsed out of this. And I have the great pleasure and fortune to work with John Lilly, who was one of the partners over there who co-developed this strategy and who was my boss when I was at Mozilla. I want to focus on the earlier stages of the scaling. So we're not talking about how do you scale a company once it has hit like 1,000 people or 10,000 people, where you will hit very, very different problems. I want to speak about the early phases, and I think it's prudent because given that most of you are in early stages of your company. So here's phase one. Phase one is really you and your buddies. So this is your typical company, like less than 10 people, your classic startup. And what happens in phase one is you actually don't need to think about scaling at all, because in phase one, really the key priorities for you is product, 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 and then eventually people, people, people. What this means is, as long as you haven't reached product market fit, as long as you haven't reached this moment, this intersection point where your product actually fits nicely into the market and it fits a customer need, you really do not need to think about scaling. The things you need to think about is product. How do you develop your product? How do you get to product market fit? And there's techniques around rapid prototyping. There's a methodology which was developed by Jack Knapp, who was back in the day at Google Ventures, called the sprint model. You might have heard of the lean startup approach from Eric Ries. All these are very valid ways to get to product market fit quickly and cheaply. The second part of this is, in this phase, you need to think about the people as well. People make or break companies. There's absolutely no question about this. And you need to figure out, like, your first hires are paramount for your success. And your first hires will typically be generalists. Because, in the early phases, like, there's so much stuff you need to do and so much divergent stuff and so much stuff you can't figure out quite yet, that you should really not hire specialists, but you need people who are able to, like, jump back and forth between the different jobs which need to be done. And really, strategy as per se doesn't really matter, because, like, literally, like, you changing, like, your company on a dime. So here's the good news for phase one. If you're in phase one, if you're like the 2/3 of our viewers and listeners who are currently on the less than 10 people, you don't need to worry all that much about strategy. Really focus your attention towards product and people. Once you grow out of this, once you get to product market fit, you really move into phase two. And phase two is what we call the market share phase. So in phase two, you have reached initial product market fit, and now it's all about execution. Now you want to capture market share. And in this phase, it is incredibly important for you to move faster than your competition. This is the phase where you really put the foot on the pedal in terms of getting to market share, grabbing market share. And it's also a phase where you need to look very carefully at what is the competition doing. And this determines your scaling strategy. So if you have a lot of competition in your market, you might need to, and it's a market where you need to grab market share from your competition. So it's kind of like a winner takes it all. You take the competition, you take your customers from your competition. It's one of those markets where you have to invest into scale. In other markets where the market is very immature, say you're doing something which hasn't been done before, and there's probably only one or two other people in this market, that situation might look different because the market itself is developing, the market itself is growing, so you're in a growing pie market where the section of the pie you're capturing by and of itself is already still growing. So you might be less concerned about hypergrowth and investing into hypergrowth, but rather concerned into still building the market. So here in this phase, you really want to focus on execution and continuously adjusting for product market fit. What you'll also find in terms of your people is that here we'll see specialization starts to occur. So here, like, you've got someone looking more into the marketing side of things, and you've got people who are really more focused on the product side of things. So this is where you start phasing out and building the structure for your company and readying it for scale, which gets us to phase number 3, which is called the Dunbar's number phase. So Dunbar was a sociologist who in the 60s and 70s did some groundbreaking studies finding that companies, social structures really, change dramatically once you get above 150 to 200 people. The reason for that is we as humans seem to be capable of easily keeping about 150 to 200 people in our heads and keep those relationships in our heads. Once you get beyond that, that breaks down. What this means is once your company hits about 100, 150, 200 people, everything starts to change pretty dramatically. So here your scaling is driven by two factors. The one is getting the right structures in place for your company to actually move from a phase where it's a bunch of people in a room, everybody knowing what each other is doing, to really a company structure where you have departments and department heads and strategy, as well as looking deeply into what the market is doing. So here in this phase, you're really, really driven by what is the market doing, what are the competitors doing, and that determines your scaling strategy. So I want to pull out a few universal truths which we found to be relevant across all stages, and something we teach in our programs and when you work with us. And so one of the reasons why we give you these advisors who work with you, because they've been through this process a couple of times. So your first universal truth is numbers and data. I can't stress this enough, which is the notion that what you can't measure, you can't control. And I see particularly early phases of a companies being a little sloppy on the idea of understanding their numbers and digging deep into them, because everything feels still so raw and if you fly by the seats of your pants, which is all fine. And I'm not advocating for elaborate data rooms and big data systems, etc. But you need to understand what are what we call the key performance indicators, what are the main levers for your company, and how do you leverage those to get to scale. We'll see this later in a concept called the flywheel, where data is incredibly important, because without data you will never understand what your business looks like. So establish from the get-go a very good hygiene around capturing some key data points, making sure that if you're building software, for example, you instrumentalize the software so you know what people are doing in your software, and you know what your funnel looks like. So in terms of how many people are signing up, how many people are going to convert into paying customers, how many people stay with your software, etc. 500 Startups, the original founder of 500 Startups, Dave McClure, once published a very, very good methodology which he calls the ARG metrics, metrics for pirates. I highly recommend checking those out. It's all about customer acquisition and basically how the funnel works. This goes to this point of numbers and data. The second universal truth is really around people. I mentioned this earlier. It's incredibly important to hire the right people. There's a famous saying here in Silicon Valley, and which has spread across the world now, which is A people hire A people, because A people, meaning people who are top of their game, they want to be around people who are top of their game. But B people, so people who are okay but not great, they tend to hire people who are not quite as good as them, because they're threatened by A people. They want to feel probably superior to the people. And what happens is you've got B people, they hire C people, and C people hire D people, and it's a downward spiral. Something Guy Kawasaki, who was one of the earliest Apple employees, calls the bozo explosion. So be careful with that. There's an interesting part in there, which is you'll see this often when companies mature, that your early employees, they were great in the beginning. They're really amazing people, but they tend to stick around. And then when they stick around, sometimes they end up in positions where they're actually not quite as good anymore. But they have a lot of sway in the company because they were employee number 2 or employee number 1. And then you have a person who's probably not quite as good in a position which is too much of a stretch for them. So be incredibly careful with that, because it's very, very easy to fall into this trap of having people who are okay and mediocre and not excellent. Companies are won by people. Silicon Valley invests into people, not into companies. So cannot stress this enough. Spend a lot of time on getting the right people into the door and making sure that they're set up for success. Here's your third truth, and this is, I mentioned this earlier, this idea of the flywheel. And the flywheel is, I first came across this in the early days of Amazon, where there was an internal paper which kind of semi-legally, I guess, circulated on the internet, where they deconstructed what is called the Amazon flywheel. And it's interesting because we had something very similar. Alas, we didn't use the term flywheel when I was at eBay. So I used to work at eBay in the early days. Here's how this works. What you need to find for growth and what you need to find for scale is a self-reinforcing system. And Amazon has hit this really, really nicely. So what happens is, if Amazon has a large selection of goods, which was the reason why they started out with books, because they could have the largest selection of books on the planet, because Jeff Bezos back in the day could simply use the existing catalogs of literally 1 million books and offer you 1 million books by simply tapping into an existing system. So by having a large selection, you create a great customer experience because customers find what they're looking for, and probably they find also the hidden gems they couldn't find in a bookstore, because an average bookstore only has a couple 10,000 books, right? That leads to traffic. That traffic leads to sellers wanting to be there. That leads to more sellers putting more stuff on your platform, leading to a higher selection, and you get this reinforcing circular wheel, which leads to growth. And growth then leads to a lower cost structure, because the bigger you get, the better you can control your cost, which leads to lower prices, which adds to the customer experience. And you create this really beautiful flywheel, which is really hard. Once you get this starting, it's really, really hard to beat. Now, here's the interesting thing about a flywheel. It's really important to understand that a flywheel is a wheel, so it needs to be balanced. So as you're going through this, you need to shift your attention from side to side, right? If you're only focusing on, let's say, the customer experience, but neglect working with your sellers and making sure your sellers are happy, if you're in a two-sided marketplace, in this Amazon example, what happens is you have an unbalanced flywheel and it doesn't work. So when I was at eBay, as you know, eBay is this wonderful marketplace for selling, back in the day it was largely used goods. It has changed over time. But it was really about striking this balance between having enough sellers and thus enough inventory on the side, having enough buyers who buy this stuff, and then slowly and surely, like by switching sites all the time, growing this into this incredible force which became a flywheel, which was unstoppable, which is the reason why eBay, to this day, is the largest auction site on the planet. So keep this in mind. Like, you have to find a flywheel. This is the only way you can actually get to scale and growth. Cognitive load becomes an interesting challenge. And what this means is that as your company grows, as you're scaling, the demands on you and your people in terms of like your cognitive, your mental demands increase exponentially. It's incredibly hard to run scaling businesses. So what you have to do is you have to be very, very careful and very deliberate to keep your team small and nimble, to reduce cognitive load, because it's one of the typical traps we'll find companies falling into, which is that they get to a point where the complexity of their company, the complexity of their scaling model is so high, and they have done so little to reduce the cognitive load for their people, that it is incredibly hard for them to maintain their growth after a certain point, because you simply cannot keep it in your head anymore. So as you're going through your scaling and as you're going through your growing up phases, really pay attention that you keep your cognitive load relatively low by making sure you empower people, you distribute workload, you distribute decision making, and have teams being small and nimble. Which gets us to the last point, which is process. As you're growing, and my dear colleague Monique is a adamant fighter for process. It's really important that you're building just enough process. So it's a tricky path to walk on, because you can have too much process. Process can get definitely in your way, but without process you cannot scale. So you need to figure out like what are the biggest leverage points for you. Where are you spending most time, and what is the stuff you repeat most of the time, and then turn those into processes. I find software engineers are pretty good at this typically, because as a software engineer, once you've typed a command the third time, and let's say it's a complex like chain of commands, you write a little script to do this for you, because you're just like bored by it and you don't want to do it anymore. Apply the same thinking to all the other processes you have in your company and start documenting them. This is really important as well. If the process is only in your head, it will never scale. If you document it, you can give it to someone else, you can empower them, and they run with that process. So think about process. Let me end on a warning. And I mentioned this earlier, or hinted towards this earlier. There's a real problem we'll find, which is around what we call premature scaling. So the idea of like you scale and you think about scaling when you're actually not ready for it. We'll find this a lot when we talk to startups which are, like 2 people in a garage, 5 people in a little office, probably even 10 people, which when you haven't found product market fit, when you haven't found the way to grow your flywheel, when you haven't found the components of your flywheel and haven't really understood your business model, it's really dangerous to scale because you can scale very quickly into a non-sustainable world where you spend, for example, more money on customer acquisition, so getting a customer, than that customer is worth to you. And if you're in that world, you're in a world of hurt because you're losing money. You're bleeding money with every customer. The worst case scenarios are, and we've seen this with companies, is companies actually get to scale. So they found a flywheel which gets them to get more customers, but they lose money with every single more customer. So they end in a situation where they sign up more and more and more customers, and they lose more and more and more money without having actually figured out their business model. This is a very dangerous position to be in, so that I highly recommend to try to avoid this and become very, very careful about this. So with that, and I know this is like the super short, 20-minute version of scaling, and this clearly warrants day-long workshops, which by the way, when you're part of our programs, we of course do sit down with you, right? So this is like just a taster of what are the highlights of what we have learned around scaling. But with that, I want to go into Q&A and see if you have any questions for me. And I know that Monique has been monitoring questions, so I think we'll do a little bit of dialogue here. So thank you so much for paying attention so long, and we'll make sure that you get the slides and the recorded version of this afterwards.
All right, awesome. That was actually super informative, Pascal. Thank you so much, and I'm sure lots of other people are thanking you from afar. So let's dive into some of these questions. Marnik asks, how do you match potential great ideas with founders and teams? And the reason that this person is asking it is because, says, from my experience, not every idea or owner is capable of being a founder. An inventor is not always the same type of innovator or entrepreneur.
Right. So first of all, yes, I agree. I've got this slightly, some people would say obnoxious saying that ideas are cheap and plentiful. Execution is the part which is hard. Granted, there is ideas, particularly in the hard sciences space, which are not cheap and plentiful. There's absolutely no question about it. But very broadly speaking, I think there's some truth to we all can dream up ideas about building the next Uber or Airbnb or something. But executing on it is really hard, which is the reason why, again, Silicon Valley, when you talk to venture capitalists here, they're really focused, as well as we are, really focused on the people, on the team, because there's a universal truth in a great team with a mediocre idea will most likely be successful, whereas a great idea with a mediocre team will never be successful. So to your question, look for the properties you identify as necessary, and this depends a little bit from industry to industry, technology to technology, cultural context to cultural context. But focus on the properties which are important for a particular idea to be executed well in the people. If you find them lacking, see if you can augment them. So what we find quite often is we've got brilliant technologists coming to us with an idea, and they've got some idea of how to turn this into a business, but very often they don't. And then we pair them up. We find or help them find business people to help them think this through and get to execution. If you can't find this, and or your technologist, for example, is not willing to do so, I would run. I would just not engage, because it's really hard. It's if you don't execute well, it's tremendously hard. So I just heard that we've got a lot of questions, so I will keep my answers shorter. All
right. So Luis says, can you please elaborate a bit more on your universal truth number 3?
Yes, that's the flywheel. So I'll give you a simple example. So probably the easiest example to understand is marketplaces. So if you have a marketplace, if you have a flea market, let's say you run a flea market. If you want to be a buyer, if you want to go to this flea market, you only want to go to the flea market if there's enough supply. If you are a seller, you only want to go to the flea market if there's enough buyers for your stuff. So what you need to do is you need to manage supply and demand. So let's say you know that you only have 10 sellers who build up a stall. What you do is you limit the size of your flea market and probably go into a particular vertical, let's say collectible dolls or something, and then invite buyers to this flea market. And then as you're managing the two sides of this marketplace, and you start slowly adding to this marketplace. So you basically build up your flywheel. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend. So the Amazon flywheel, as mentioned, I came across this a decade ago when it wasn't public, but the Amazon flywheel is now discussed quite a bit on the internet. So I highly recommend just do a Google search for Amazon flywheel. You'll find a ton of really good examples on how you think about this for your business.
And then Luis also, this is probably a question for me, asks, can you please show the calendar of activities again? I'm assuming you're referring to SU Ventures. So I'm going to put that on the webinar right now. And there it is. You can see, feel free to take a screenshot. This will also be live on our website in the next week. All right, next question. So Laszlo asks, hi, what are the options for a startup to work with SU Ventures in Eastern Europe? And pretty straightforward, just apply to our website, su.org/ventures. What we'll do is there's a series of questions that we'll ask of you, and then our portfolio manager will take a look. We'll have a small amount of diligence done, and we'll have an interview, and that's about it. It's a very simple process, and you get an answer pretty quickly as well. Warner asks, at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned impact, and only 3% of entrepreneurs are focused on impact. He goes on to say, I'm a data scientist and have thought about impact quantitatively. How do you measure entrepreneurial impact? And let me answer that question first, and then I'll continue reading more of his question. So the 3% number I pulled from a GEM study. It's a Global Entrepreneurship Monitor study. And what they did is the criteria, it was all self-reported and done in 31 different economies. The individuals, and it was defined by the individuals who are starting or leading any kind of activity, organization, or initiative that has a particularly social, environmental, or community objective. So I'll put the study in the chat. Michelle, can I do that? Okay, I'll put the study in if you want. No, we can send it out in the follow-up email. Okay, I'll send the study out in the follow-up email if anybody's curious about that further. All right, next question. So Sixto asks, when AI plays an important role in your business model, makes sense to start with human intelligence and then migrate and scale with artificial intelligence once you have the learning points clear. I think it's a question, so.
Yeah, let's put a question mark behind it.
Yeah.
I think it depends. It depends on what your model is, and I think it depends on what you want to use your AI algorithm against. If you're building a system which is supposed to act and behave like a human, let's say you have a chatbot which does, I don't know, reservations, that might be a very good idea because it allows you to use humans and human intelligence to train your AI algorithm. There's other examples where you use AI for very specific machine interface questions. Let's say you use an AI algorithm to determine when a particular machine is likely to fail due to parts being worn out. I would argue that makes no sense or little sense because you're typically relying on sensor data, et cetera. So it really depends on in which domain you want to apply AI.
Okay. So forgive me, I'm probably going to pronounce your name right, but know that I deeply care about its proper pronunciation. So Amog says, impact tech, in quotes, is starting to carve out a niche for itself, especially in places like Silicon Valley and San Francisco where we are based. It's a given that product market fit takes much, much more validation than a traditional B2C venture. Do you have any words of wisdom for such B2B impact tech ventures of today, especially in terms of scaling?
I don't know if it's a given. If you have a solution, let's say you've got a technological solution to do clean drinking water out of, whatever, sewage water. Getting to product market fit is a pretty simple and very straightforward, going into the field and trying out your solution. So I'm not sure if that's a given. And I think the methodologies are very similar, if not the same, to get to product market fit, which is try it out, get it in front of customers, early, very early, and very, very iterative. I probably can't recommend highly enough the sprint methodology, which was developed by Google Ventures, Jake Knapp. You'll find it on the web. There's a book around it. Google itself has the resources available for free. It's a really wonderful way to think about how do you get very quickly to product iterations. Other methodologies are design thinking. So go to the website of the Stanford D School. They have very good resources here. Similar resources you'll find on the website of IDEO. They've built a framework around this. So you'll find a lot of resources, very good resources on the web on how to get to validated learning, which gets you to product market fit.
So Sean asks, at what stage should we be applying for SU Ventures given the focus on the 3 C's? So we are only as helpful, Ventures is only helpful for people or startups that have entities. By the time we're making connections or introducing you to capital sources or introducing you to large corporations within our network, it's good for you to have, you don't need to be at product market fit, but you need to have product or some semblance of product or be able to very clearly communicate what your product is going to be. So we also do have an incubator, though, for anybody here who's either an intrapreneur or an entrepreneur, or maybe you're an aspiring entrepreneur with an idea, but you haven't actually turned it into a product yet. And there is no entity for that, and you can check that out on our website as well. But really, at the heart of what we do is connecting people, and so having an entity in place with some product is a really good fit for us. And is SU Ventures looking for companies in phase 1? And by phase 1, Dana, I assume you mean at the idea phase. If that's not, just pop something in the chat and I'll rephrase or I'll re-answer the question. But again, if you just have an idea, you're working on trying to find a team, then our incubator is probably a better fit for you. Once you do get to product, some level of traction in the market, then Ventures will be a really great fit for you. All right, love all these great questions, y'all. Keep them coming. All right, excuse me. Again, I care deeply about the pronunciation of your name, but I don't know how to do it. So Loki asks, how does this scaling differ for marketplaces where a certain degree of users on both sides are required to generate the type of movements, finding each other to proof of product market fit?
Yep, that's a really good question. So I give you the eBay example. What you do is, and I alluded to this a little earlier already, what you do is you'll find a niche in your overall marketplace where you can safely assume that you have enough buyers and sellers to start with. And then surely, there's always some magic around, like you need to convince your first few sellers to get the party started, right? That's your sales skill. But here's what we did with eBay. We started with collectibles because we knew that collectibles already had a market, that there's an offline structure called the flea market where this already happens. So we started with that category. So did, anything from small antiques, stamps, all kinds of other collectible stuff. And then we created a category which we called Other, where we allowed people to just upload whatever they wanted to upload. And then we monitored this category very, very carefully. And once we saw that there was, for example, a critical mass of people wanting to sell and buy computers, we started adding a computer category. And then we monitored that category very carefully as we saw then that category got bigger and bigger and bigger and fragmented into, let's say, for example, hardware and software. So we split the category into hardware and software. But that's basically how you grow marketplaces. You need to find a linchpin. There's something called the bowling alley strategy. So if you're a bowler, you know that in bowling you don't try to get all the pins. what you do is you try to find your first pin, which then leads to like toppling all the other pins. So your strategy is to play the bowling alley, to find what is your first pin. In our case, it was collectibles, and then like the first pin then leads to the second pin. In our case, it was actually computers and electronics, and then from there it is like if everything goes well, you go to world dominance.
World dominance, love it. All right. So Joseph says, hey, could you throw some more light on the universal truth number 4, please?
Yeah, sure. Cognitive load. So here's the challenge. You as the CEO and your leadership team, as you grow, will encounter that the systems, everything around you will become significantly more complex. It's a whole different game to like sell one product into one market to one customer for one particular niche. Once you like go and do this in many more markets or into many more niches or many more products, it becomes significantly more complex. So what happens is your cognitive load increases. Now, I find a lot of startups when they're hindered by the fact that they didn't consider this as they were scaling and operate very much under the assumption that companies are just like, largely run by the CEO in his head. What leads to like your cognitive load getting so high that you can't actually execute anymore, or you're limiting your growth by basically the complexity you can handle. So what you need to do is you need to parcel out that complexity. And one of the hardest things for a lot of founders is to distribute decision making. So you basically say, okay, so I'm not caring about, I don't know, let's say marketing, but I'm giving marketing to John, and John will make those decisions. The challenge a lot of founders have is that they want to have everything done to 100%, and they want to have it done to like their particular standard of like what they believe the world should be. And now they see John doing like an 80% job in their view, and then being dissatisfied, pulling it back to themselves, etc. There's a very famous saying, which is, if someone else can do your job at 80% capacity, always outsource it. Always like move it on to someone else. It removes it unloads your cognitive load and allows you to scale. So I hope that helps a little bit to understand the concept. But it's really important to understand, like to figure that out for yourself as you're growing, because you will see that the constraint, you will become, as particularly as the founder, as the CEO, you will become the limiting factor in your growth if you're not distributing your cognitive load and empowering your people. And then your people need to empower their people, right? That's the part where you want to build small and nimble teams which can actually act on this.
Awesome. Amelia asks, hey, any advice regarding scaling a B Corp from inception intends to address from inception tends to or intends to address one of the global grand challenges?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think first of all, like a B Corp is not any different than, and by the way, I think a nonprofit is not any different than a corporate. It has different funding sources, it has different finance strategy, but everything else is pretty much the same. It's like you need to think about the same issues. What you'll of course find is that your go-to-market strategy is different. Your approach to funders is different because you apply to funders with a very different story, which is, hey, we're solving a really big problem, and in the good cases, of course, you'll find people who care about that, versus, I don't know, you build another lemonade stand or you build another photo sharing app or something, and basically you have a very different story behind that. But overall, I think the methodologies are very similar. Again, like I think the really big difference is funding and how to think about funding, which is a reason why you might have seen this in the overview slide. We actually pull those apart where we talk about non-dilutive sources of funding, which is grants, etc., versus equity funding, which is your typical venture capital style funding. They're very different. You need to position your company very different. You need to talk about your company very differently. So I think on the finance and funding side, companies differ quite a bit. In the execution, largely, I tell you, the best nonprofits and the best B Corps, they just run like any other company as well.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of interesting trends in blended capital models as well as where some of these impact startups will leverage non-dilutive capital from grants and government contracts, et cetera, and then go on to de-risk the technology, de-risk the market, and then bring in venture capital down the road. And these types of startups still maintain a lot of control over the entity, therefore keeping control of the mission, which is really cool. So Michael asks, I'm in SU's Exponential Foundation series, a member of Abundance 360 Digital as well. Is SU Ventures structure like SU Exponential Foundations where you open until you're full, you have a class, or do you stay open for the right company all year long? Great question, Michael. So we have an open application process, and we're just constantly on the look for startups focused on impact. And
we might have an audio problem. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
All of a sudden I'm seeing a lot of feedback. Please let us know if you can hear us right now. Okay, go ahead and continue.
Okay.
If you're having any audio difficulties, try refreshing your browser or adjusting your your speaker. Sorry for the interruption. Just want to make sure that the Q&A session could continue with audio.
Cool. Thanks, Michelle. All right. So we have an open application process. You can sign up or check us out any time of the year. And then it's very different than Exponential Foundation series because it's focused specifically for startups. So these are all going to be two team founders or more. It's different than Abundance 360 Digital because that is Peter Diamandis' product. But there is some, Peter is actually one of the founders of Singularity University, so there's going to be some common language there. But these, SU Ventures is really about the individual needs, the individual unique needs of the startups in our portfolio. All right, next question. Ed, hello. Hi, Monique, nice to hear your voice. What are the costs associated with SU Ventures, or is that info on the website? So SU Ventures, there's no cost. We are an equity for services model. We take anywhere between 1% to 3% depending on the startup. And the reason that we do it like that is because as a startup, we know that the primary currency that you have to give is equity in your startup. And rather than position ourselves like a traditional accelerator wanting 7 to 10%, we stay very, very low because we think that you can participate in ventures and then also do, a YCOM or a 500 or any other one of the accelerators within the ecosystem. And what we want you to always do is maintain complete control of your entity because that's how impact actually happens is over time. Thanks for asking, Ed. All right. Santiago says, my question is about AI. The most moonshot ideas, or the most ideas for moonshots that I think need AI, how do we need to see and deal with exponential technologies at this point? Do we need to go deep and develop AI algorithms or wait till there's AI standards and then implement them into our moonshots?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's early days in AI, for sure. I think we have a few pretty robust AI frameworks now, which are useful in some cases, not all. Particular TensorFlow, which is the AI released by Google, is making quite a few waves here. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So the question is, for me, is much more about what do you actually want to achieve, and how do you achieve that best? And then figuring out what does the market offer today to solve for this problem. One important part here is that a lot of people, AI is this massively hyped thing today. And in a lot of cases, when people talk about AI, what they actually mean is machine learning. Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, machine learning is nothing else than statistics. It's not magic. Machine learning is really not magic. It's basically just applying some statistical algorithms on a larger set of data, which for a lot of companies and a lot of use cases is actually what you need to do. Whereas the more, let's say, hyped AI algorithms around deep learning, neural networks, etc., they are useful for certain particularly use cases. Let's say you want to identify cats in videos. That's what you do with a convolutional network, aka something like TensorFlow. Those are fairly early in their development. I think they're robust enough to start building against. One thing I would encourage everyone is, if you're interested in this topic, start working on it for sure, because the technology moves really, really fast. And the thing you don't want to have happen is You wait until the fabled 1.0 release of, let's say, TensorFlow, by which time, like everybody else, has a massive edge on you because they've been using this for the last year, and you have to learn from scratch. So I would go in early, and again, like it really comes down to like figuring out what you actually want to achieve.
Great. So Ren asked, how do you work with companies in the UK? And same way we work with everybody else. So our programs are boot camps. The reason that we set them up as boot camps and they're short in duration is so that you can come and participate when it's relevant for you. So the value proposition that we offer is our programs are available for the life of your startup. So you can come and take as many boot camps as you want in these different categories, come and participate in our sprints. You can do all of them in 1 year, you could do one of them in a year, you could do two in year 1 and 5 in year 3, completely up to you. And if you're interested or you have more questions about this, there will be another webinar on December 14th that's specifically for asking questions and getting deep into the program details of SU Ventures. So thanks for asking, Ren. Lola Meyer says, what is the criteria of selection of startups for SU Ventures programs? Great question. Key point number 1 is it has to be mission aligned. I love all startups, but I really love those that are trying to change the world and that I want to put all of our resources behind to help them achieve their mission. So impact is number 1 priority. From there, we look for team, some level of product, some degrees of product market fit, depending we are as valuable to you as you are in terms of your overall development. So the more you have to share, the more traction that you have, the better we can amplify what you're working on. And also there's something tangible there that we can help you dig into the details and strategize and work on your startup with. So great question. All right, Pascal, how important do you think it is to having a product for someone to believe in your idea?
How important is it for someone to start to believe in their idea? Well, if you don't believe in your idea, I don't know why you're doing it. I mean,
well, I think he's asking, like, do you have to have a product in order for them to believe in you?
Oh, I see. Well, good question. So personally, I'm always, and this is just a very personal observation, but like I'm always a little hesitant when someone comes with an idea and they haven't actually done anything, because it indicates a little bit that like you're in the idea dream phase, but you haven't actually executed against it. So at the bare minimum, I would love for you to have done some customer and user research, probably have built like a paper prototype or like the easiest form of like testing it out. Just something which conveys to me, and by the way, I think this is true for venture capitalists, for example, as well, which just conveys to me that you're serious about this, and it's not just like a hypothetical, interesting thing in your head. So yeah, I think that's probably it.
Cool. I think we have time for one more.
One more question.
All right. So we have had strong traction and good acceptance, but B2B has too long sales cycle. Now we do freemium with much higher adoption rates, but seek alternative income streams. Is there a good resource on possible marketplace B2B2C income streams?
Holy shit. Oh my God, I think that's a very, very specific question, and I think it's, so I wouldn't know how to answer this in a broad, generalized, sweeping way. I think it really depends on, what is the particular solution you're offering and which market are you offering it, et cetera. I think there's many examples of companies leveraging like a B2B2C market, but it really depends. I wouldn't know how to answer this properly without knowing more about your particular market.
Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. We have another one coming up on December 14th that's specifically on ventures. If you want to join us again, mark your calendars. Probably same time, same place, a computer near you or the one on your lap. We'll have a follow-up email coming out, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And that'll have the recording, so for anybody who wants to re-listen or see the points that were made today, the recording will be made available and sent out shortly.
Okay, fantastic. All right, our doors are coming. They're breaking us down. We got to get kicked out of here, and we're out of here. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.